Well, we're in the second week of our sermon series, Dream On. We're looking at dreams and dreamers in the Bible, and how their stories can inform the dreams we have, both for ourselves and for the church. And no sermon series on dreams and dreamers would be complete without taking a look at Joseph. Now understand, this is the Joseph of the Old Testament. The Joseph of the New Testament, Mary's husband, Jesus' earthly father, well, he had some dreams too. We may look at those later on, but today we're talking about Joseph of the Old Testament, the son of Jacob that we talked about last week. Now this Joseph is probably the most famous dreamer of the Bible. And we could probably do an entire sermon series on Joseph and his dreams. But today, we're focusing on these dreams that we read about, the first dreams that Joseph had, at least the first dreams that are recorded. And at this point, when he had these dreams, Joseph was nobody in particular. Yeah, he was Jacob's son. That probably gave him a certain amount of respect. But, Joseph had 11 brothers. 10 of them were older than he was. As the 11th one in line, Joseph was probably not considered to be all that special. And then, too, Joseph was only 17 years old when he had these dreams. Now, granted, when you were 17 back then, it was probably you were more of an adult than when you're 17 today. But still, he was not a fully grown man yet. He had a bunch of older brothers who were fully grown. Chances are, those older brothers had gotten pretty used to bossing Joseph around. That's kind of how it works with older brothers. They probably thought they had the right to tell Joseph what to do, and probably Joseph thought so too. Just kind of the way it works. Especially back then, it was the way it worked. And then Jacob probably did not make things easier on Joseph by appearing to favor him so much. Joseph's brothers came to resent that, as we would probably expect them to. So whenever Jacob was not around to protect him, Joseph's brothers were probably even harder on him than they would have been otherwise. So here's Joseph, still a kid in a lot of ways, out tending flocks with his brothers. He has this dream, actually two dreams, and they're pretty similar. In each one, all of his brothers are symbolically bowing down to him. In the second dream, Joseph's mother and father are bowing down to him too. Now, of course, Joseph's brothers don't like hearing that very much. They get even more upset with Joseph when he tells them about this. And if you know the story, you know that Joseph's brothers came to hate him so much, they eventually sold him into slavery in Egypt. But the point of this sermon series is to have the dreams and dreamers we're talking about inform our own process of dreaming for ourselves and for the church. So what do we learn from the story of Joseph and his dreams? I think there are a few things that we can learn from it. One of them reiterates a point that we talked about last week. This was not Joseph's dream for himself. This was God's dream for Joseph. Joseph would have had no reason whatsoever to think he was going to grow up and have his brothers and even his parents bowing down to him. Probably not something that would have even ever occurred to him that would happen. Just like we talked about last week, God's dreams for us are often way beyond anything that you and I would ever dream for ourselves. Joseph's dream certainly was. And another thing we can learn is that when God gives us a big dream, we should not be scared of it. Joseph was not scared of it. Joseph hadn't told people what his dream was, regardless of the consequences. And Joseph had to know that his brothers were not going to like it very much when he told them about this dream. He may not have known they were going to go so far as to sell him into slavery, but he had to know they were not going to like it. They were not going to be happy when Joseph told them this dream. But it did not matter, because Joseph was not going to be scared of telling people God's dream for him. He had faith that since it was God's dream, he did not need to worry about what might happen. He had faith that God's dreams always come true. And Joseph continued to have that faith, even when things went against him. And maybe that's the most important lesson of all. Because when we want something, we tend to want it to happen right away, right? I know I do. When I want something to happen, I want it to happen right now. I think most of us are probably like that. And when we get a dream from God, when God tells us that something's going to happen, well, we expect God to make it happen right away. But sometimes it does not. In fact, sometimes it looks like things are going in the exact opposite direction, and we cannot see how that dream we got from God is possibly going to come true. We don't see how it's going to happen the way things are going right now. And that's pretty much what happened to Joseph. Joseph had a lot of times in his life when it looked like everything went wrong. First, as I said, he gets sold into slavery. And if you know the story, later on, he gets put in jail on a trumped-up charge. He's left there for years. When Joseph got sold into slavery, he must have wondered what in the world was going on. He must have wondered, how could this dream that he'd been given from God possibly ever come true? And then he gets knocked down again, even lower than he was before. He's in jail with no real reason to think he's ever going to get out. How in the world would anyone, let alone his brothers, ever bow down to him when he's in prison? And yet, through all of this, Joseph stayed faithful to God. Joseph remembered the dream that God had given him, and Joseph continued to believe that the dream was going to come true. No matter how bad things got for Joseph, he never lost his faith. He just kept doing his best, kept trusting in God, and he never gave up. When Joseph got sold into slavery, he stayed faithful to God. He was the best slave that he could possibly be. And people saw that. And eventually he got put in charge of all of the business affairs of a very wealthy man. When he went to jail, he stayed faithful to God. He was the best prisoner he could be. People saw that. He got put in charge of all the affairs of the prisoners. Finally, when he got a chance, he proved his worth to Pharaoh himself. He got put in charge of all of the affairs of Egypt, with only the Pharaoh himself above him. And ultimately, when a drought forced his brothers to come to Egypt to try to get food, his brothers did bow down to him, just like God had said. When God gives us a dream, God does not promise it's going to happen in a nice, straight, smooth, easy way. God certainly sent Joseph the long way around, and God sends us the long way around sometimes too. Why? There could be a lot of reasons why. But the thing is, when we're going the long way around, it can be really easy to get discouraged. It can be really easy to doubt. It can be really easy to think, well, maybe I misunderstood what God was telling me. Maybe I did not interpret that dream the right way. Maybe that dream did not actually come from God at all. Maybe I was just fooling myself. Maybe I was just trying to convince myself this was God's dream for me. Maybe it's not even going to happen, because I sure don't see any reason to think it's going to happen now. It's interesting that after Joseph had those two initial dreams, we're not told of him ever having another one that would confirm them. We're not told God ever gave Joseph another dream that would tell him, yeah, those dreams are actually going to happen. While Joseph was a slave, while Joseph was in prison, God did not, as far as we know, give Joseph any other divine message to say, hang in there, remember what I told you, it's still going to happen, don't give up. It was up to Joseph to remember and to trust and to not doubt, even if he never heard from God again. And I think that's a lesson for us too. Because that's the way it always seems to be when someone gets a message from God in the Bible, especially if it's a dream. Once God gives somebody a dream, it's the last time they hear from God in regard to that. That God does not keep coming back to remind them of it. Once God gives us a dream, it's up to us to stay faithful, because God's not likely to keep reassuring us about it. God's not likely to come back and say, remember what I said? I really meant it. It's really going to happen. Hang in there. Don't give up. God gives us the message. God gives us the dream. Then God leaves it up to us to stay faithful to God and stay faithful to the dream that God's given us. So as we think about our individual futures, as we think about the future of this church, let's remember the example of Joseph. We need to do whatever we can to follow God's dream for us. We need to not be scared of it, even if it's a really big dream that we have. We need to not worry about what other people might think about that dream. We need to continue to do our best, to have faith in God's dream, even when things seem to be going against us. We need to keep trusting God and never give up, no matter what happens. And we need to not demand that God confirm that dream for us, because God tends not to do that. God gives us the dream and leaves it up to us to stay faithful. God has a big dream for each one of us. God has a big dream for this church. Let's follow God's dream without fear, even if it's a big dream, because we know that no word from God will ever fail. Amen.